to one of the very last sessions in the Festival of the Future City, which is part of the Bristol Festival of Ideas. This evening we're going to be talking about Brexit and the future of cities. Not to be confused with cities and the future of Brexit. We have a fantastic, knowledgeable, experienced panel tonight, and I'm going to ask them each to speak for 7 or 8 minutes. Then I'll ask them some questions, but we're going to save plenty of time for you to make your contributions, ask your questions, because this is really designed to be more of a conversation than anything else. So without further ado, if I may, I think, Anand, I'm going to turn to you. Anand Menon runs the UK in a Changing Europe, which promotes rigorous research into the changing relationship, you might now even say volatile relationship, between the UK and the EU. And he has a book out next week called Brexit and British Politics, published by Polity, which he assures me is the ultimate Christmas present. So without further ado,
thank you very much. So let me summarise my message in 2 words, which are Amazon and pre-order. I'm a fraud on this panel in the sense that I know very little about cities. I grew up in a pretty horrible city, but that's about my full extent of knowledge. But I know about Brexit. So what I'm going to do is, in a sense, put a bit of a framework to this, talk a little bit about Brexit, what it might mean for cities, and actually end up talking about what I think is the most important thing, which is the place of cities and towns in our politics and in the Brexit referendum. First thing to say in terms of introduction is we have no earthly clue what Brexit is going to look like. We have no earthly clue what Brexit is going to look like for at least 2 reasons. One, because I don't think our government particularly does, and what they end up with is going to depend on a negotiation that is out of their control. But secondly, we don't know what Brexit is going to end up like, because the fragility of the government and the volatility of our politics means that any conceivable outcome is still possible. So if you take a spectrum from Britain falling out of the European Union with no trade deal and no Article 50 deal as one extreme, which, take it from me, will be appallingly bad, to us deciding at some point in the next 12 to 14 months to hold another referendum and voting to stay in, I think any of those outcomes are still possible because our Parliament and our government are so unpredictable. So talking in detailed terms about what Brexit means for anything is impossible because we don't know what Brexit means. But assuming that we do leave the European Union, there are several things that can be said about the impact this will have on cities in our country. Firstly, cities will lose an important site of representation and voice, if you like. The Committee of the Regions has been an EU institution that hasn't been particularly powerful, but has nonetheless provided a place where subnational authorities can meet, can talk, can register protests about what they see as overreach by EU institutions, can insist on the need for localism. That will be gone. So too will the opportunity for representatives of British local government to interact with representatives of local government around the rest of the European Union, which is almost as important. That's to say, the ability of representatives of cities and of regions to work together, talk together, get to know each other, learn lessons from each other, will be lost to representatives in this country. More worrying, or as worrying, is the fact that when the powers come back from Brussels, we don't know where they're going to land, but we can have a pretty good guess. The withdrawal bill, which if you're really desperate we can talk about in questions, but the withdrawal bill makes it pretty clear that the government is in the process of a power grab. And that is a power grab both from local government and from devolved government in the United Kingdom. That is to say, even powers that are formally devolved to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland are being repatriated in the first instance, as the phraseology goes, to Westminster. And people in Westminster will then decide what will happen. So actually, we end up with centralisation twice. We end up centralisation because we lose that site of democratic activity in Brussels, and centralisation secondly because powers don't go back to Westminster and then devolve down, but they stay in Westminster. So the British state looks a lot more centralised after Brexit almost certainly than it did before. But turn this upside down, and talk for a minute, not about what Brexit means for cities, but what cities have meant for Brexit. And by that I mean that one of the crucial things about contemporary Britain is a new division that has become apparent since it was there a little bit in 2015, but certainly since the 2016 referendum and certainly with the 2027 election, is the political gulf between cities and towns. And this is important not just for us, because exactly the same patterns can be seen in the US election, exactly the same patterns can be seen more or less in the French and Dutch elections as well. And in this country, what you see is that cities are Labour and towns are Tory. Cities are Remain and towns are Leave. Cities are doing relatively well economically, towns in general are declining economically. You can make, I mean, I can dig into this a bit more if you want. You can say that small towns, ironically enough, do better than big towns in many cases. But what you find is that towns are sites of economic decline and of the kind of hankering after a happier past that marks so many of the people who voted for Brexit. Towns are overwhelmingly white. Cities are overwhelmingly multiracial. Towns are overwhelmingly full of people who don't have anything above a school education. Cities have a disproportionate number of university graduates. Actually, I should say in parentheses, the single greatest predictor in our politics now of how you voted in the referendum and how you vote in general elections is whether or not you have a degree. Labour has become the party of people with university degrees, and the Tories has become the party of people without, and it is absolutely staggering the correlation between that simple variable and how you voted. But it strikes me that this distinction between towns and cities is one of the fundamental political problems of our time. Successful cities, and political rhetoric is all about successful cities, isn't it? It's all about building up Manchester as a northern powerhouse. It's all about building, one day when the government realises there's life above Watford, a train link between Leeds and Manchester. No one talks about the surrounding towns, but if you talk about my part of the country, Leeds voted Remain. All the towns around it, including the town I grew up in, Wakefield, voted Leave. Because what you find in those towns is a successful city isn't a recipe for regional success, it's a recipe for dying towns. Because successful cities drain the life, they drain the talent, they drain the resources out of the surrounding towns. So we're ending up with very, very prosperous metropolitan centres surrounded by areas of economic decline where voting patterns are becoming increasingly anti-system. The problem, of course, is as the referendum showed, and as people who live in Bristol or people who live where I live in Oxford or people who live in London were slow to pick up on, is we're not the majority. Towns might be small, but there are an awful lot of them. And so for that reason, if for no other, it's a political issue that's worth addressing sometime pretty soon. That's about 7 minutes, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Thank you. So that's a somewhat dismal view of our future cities. Andrew Carter is Chief Executive of the Centre for Cities, which is a think tank aimed at accelerating the economic performance of UK cities. Andrew, cities and Brexit.
Yes, indeed. So I'm an economist, which is the dismal science. So you expect no uplift from me, I'm afraid, when we think about the impact of Brexit. I mean, any mainstream sensible economic study that's been done on the effect that Brexit, whether it's hard or soft, will have on the British economy overwhelmingly shows that it will be negative. The degrees of negativity will vary depending upon which type of Brexit we encounter or we suffer, but let's be in no mistake that it will be negative. Why? Well, 60% about 60% of the exports that leave our cities go into the European Union. That's an enormous sum. The US is the next largest, and it's about 15%, and China's about 4%, and everywhere else is kind of nowhere. So just think about the magnitude of that. Why does that matter? Well, because if you think about the success of our urban areas and our economy more generally over the last 20 or 30 years, it's one of the resurgence of our big cities. In a sense, Bristol today is a good representation on how our modern economy in the UK can function. If we go back to 1990, firms and population were leaving Bristol, they were leaving London, in fact. They were leaving all of our big cities. And the 25, 30 years since the early 1990s has been one of restoration, one of renaissance, one of revival in our big urban areas. That's why they voted to stay. Why? Because when we think about what's driven that renaissance, it's the type of firms that overwhelmingly gain now from being in urban areas. It's creative, it's digital, it's ICT, it's financial. All of those types of industries, those firms, they massively gain from being very close to each other. They massively gain from sharing and learning ideas, innovation between each other. Where better to do that? In big cities where the opportunity is to share and learn. That's the part of the story about why our big cities like Bristol and London and Manchester and others are coming back. Is because the economy, as we move increasingly to services, is in those sorts of things. The corresponding side is that as we've opened up education, as we've opened up our higher education in particular, and we get more and more people into university and further education, those very same people work in those very same firms that are in our cities. And they also now sort of rediscover the consumption side of the economy. They like the amenities that Bristol has to offer. They want to be back in those sorts of places, particularly our young professionals. So that's the part of the renaissance that we see in our cities. And as a result of that, Anand's entirely right. We have a polarisation of our economy, and we have a polarisation of our politics. In a sense, our urban areas are where our younger, higher skilled, more open, more diverse people are tending to migrate to and to stay. And they do have a very different outlook from vast other parts of the country. In a sense, they are attracted to the city because of the characteristics of those cities. But actually, more interestingly, from a sociological point of view, the city itself transforms those individuals. It liberalizes those individuals. So you get this feedback loop of being attracted to and being reinforced in the liberal. But as we said, it's not just happening here. It's happening in France, it's happening in the US, it's happening in Germany. You see these patterns between the places and the people that feel they are left behind and those that are making their way in the modern economy. I think this has big implications for national governments. It has big implications for national governments in very, very centralised countries. And that most definitely is what the UK is. Other countries can deal with this. The US will deal with it by essentially through a federalised system. In a sense, the president gets all the accolade and the talk, but actually cities and states get on with it. That's not the case in Britain. Our cities and our places below the national do not get on with it. So we don't have this kind of federalised system that the Germans do, for example, or the coalition-based politics that the Germans do. And that has real big implications for national governments about how they manage and govern at that national level, where there is this marked, stark and divergence between politics and economics. So I think there's some real big questions about how the shape of our economy is both influencing our politics and then, in a sense, is feeding back into our politics.
Right. So very, very helpful. Our last speaker is Anna Lisa Boni. Anna Lisa is the Secretary General of Eurocities. She spent 20 years in EU public affairs and describes herself as a committed European.
Yeah.
So welcome, Anna Lisa, from Brussels. Over to you.
Thank you. I have to say I'm really, really pleased to be here today in Bristol, not only because it's my favorite city in the UK, I even got married here, just by chance, but also because, to be part of the Festival of Ideas, it's already just a real privilege for people who are living in Brussels where it's all grey. But it's really exciting. So thank you for inviting me. Yes, I am a committed European. I'm Italian. I grew up in Luxembourg. I lived in Holland. I live now in Brussels, where I work for French regions, then for Eurocities. My husband is British. I could organize a referendum just with myself.
Very good.
But just to say that my DNA is European, so I'm committed in the sense that for me it's normal. And when I grew up, for me the UK, England was part of Europe. It was part of the project. So when I learned about Brexit at 3 o'clock in the morning, which I didn't expect, I woke up and looked and said, okay, for sure the Remain has won. And I saw that it wasn't the case. It was like, oh, shock. So, but still, I guess many of you were. But still, people like me have been very much, taken aback. But we understand. I understand why this has happened. Not only in England. I mean, you don't need a Brexit or a referendum to understand that the EU project is a little bit in crisis, or a lot in crisis, is lacking legitimacy more and more, democratic legitimacy, contact with people, understanding from people, ownership by people. It's a machinery. It's far away from people, basically, and it's leaving people behind. So the project is not going through the best phase of its life. Having said that, I think there is a strong need to build a new type of Europe. We don't have to say we don't want a Europe just because we are out. It's important to have a Europe because it's helped a lot feeling, and growing and having children that can move around and learn from each other and so on, people. But another type of project, maybe another type of functioning, another type of EU, another type of project. So that's where Eurocities, as an association of cities, major cities, but also towns, can be relevant in this kind of debate, and that's where it's a place where mayors, administrations, city councils, but also let's say, civil society or businesses or their stakeholders, let's say, can exchange, learn from each other. A bit what you said about the Committee of the Regions, which is an institution, so it's in the machinery. Eurocities, it's an NGO, it's an association, it's a voluntary membership organization that actually was created in 1986, so 30 years ago, by 5 mayors, mayors from 5 medium cities, big cities, if they are medium at the world level, if you think, but big in Europe. And one of them was Birmingham, actually, so a UK. And they just went for a drink and said, oh, guys, we need to make sure that Europe, whatever legislation, regulation, funding does, it has to have an urban dimension, a much stronger urban dimension, consideration. And in the last 30 years, this movement, this group has gone from 5 to 180. And now in the last 30 years, I have to say the urban dimension has grown. You can have, you see there's more funding arriving in cities, in different, I mean, it varies in the different countries, but there is more funding, there is more opportunities for urban actors to play a role in the EU and to, in a way, influence the legislation and things that then will even benefit territories and their realities, local realities. So Eurocities is basically a place where cities meet to influence and have, where they have dialogue with EU institutions, for instance, and also dialogue among themselves. And that's quite precious at the moment. And that's where I think in this debate it's one of the way forward for cities that are member of this network. It's a tool that can enable them to stay connected, to maintain relationship with other realities in Europe and continue even, whatever social, economic, cultural relations they've started till now. So yeah, I think that's the main thing. But we can develop further.
Great, thank you. Anand, I was interested in what you were saying about losing the opportunity to interact with representatives from other cities. And I recognize that, inside this whole discussion is we don't really know what the Brexit deal will be. But do you see, and Anna Lisa, do you see any opportunity, even when we are out of Europe, still to maintain those kinds of relationships? Because surely it must be possible for us still, to get off the island and go talk to people.
No, I mean, obviously, if people take it upon themselves to do so of their own volition, then it's absolutely possible. But I think you lose something I never thought I'd defend the Committee of the Regions, actually, which shows how the world has changed. I think there is something to be said for a formalised institution where these people can interact on a regular, ongoing basis, and where things like, you know, collaborative networks between cities take root. And it might be over a lunch, it might be whatever, but actually cities working together, cities collaborating with each other, cities learning lessons from each other is very, very important. And we just will not have the same sort of access to the same sort of regularised processes as we had as a member state.
So you think it'll, in a way, be lumpier? It'll depend a lot more on personal relationships and less on a basic infrastructure to drive that?
It'll be lumpier, and if I were to guess, I would suggest that civic leaders in all our cities are going to spend a disproportionate amount of time over the next decade fighting to avoid losing any small amount of influence they have to Westminster and the centre, rather than worrying about what goes on outside our borders. I mean, one of the things about Brexit, and you can think this is a good thing or think this is a bad thing, is that it will lead to a redesign and a redefinition of the political economy of this country, and that includes structures and institutions as well as economic life.
Okay. And Anna Lisa, will will the mayor of Bristol be able to be part of Eurocities post-Brexit? You think?
Yeah, that's one of the good things about not having an institution only. But
can I just ask you all to move the microphones a bit closer? Because apparently people are having difficulty.
But having a kind of voluntary-based organisation where people, meet because they want to meet, because they want to build relations between themselves, among themselves. So that's I think Eurocities is actually we have something like 12 cities that are part of the organisation, and they all wrote us immediately after the referendum results saying we want to stay, because at the beginning I thought, oh my God, my budget, just to make it de-dramatize. And then so the reaction was exactly the opposite. We're saying, no, actually, we need you more than ever. We want, and the good thing is that the rest, because they were also saying, oh my God, how will the other cities react towards us? Because we're not, in the EU anymore. Because anyway, you guys, you always say, I'm going to Europe, but you are in Europe. But you always say you're going to Europe. But that's the island thing. But still, people from other cities, they were all kind of welcoming and saying, no, you have to stay, we will continue the relations. There's a real interest, of course, and to keep the UK contribution, not only financial, but I mean the contribution bringing all the ideas and work that comes from the UK cities inside this kind of Europe that is a Europe of cities. Right. So that's very strong. We did even a letter to Barnier, which is the negotiator on Brexit, asking to meet the core cities, for instance, since the government, the UK government, doesn't really involve the mayors and the leaders of these cities to say GDP of the country is made on the GDP of cities. I mean, cities are contributing a lot to the wealth of the organization. They can be monsters, of course, they are monsters because they drain. That's true, but it's also true that in there are also the solutions to a lot of problems, innovation, and all you said. It's vibrant reality that make UK a strong country as well. So we're trying to see how we can, tell the UK and the EU that it's important for cities to remain in cooperation, because the impact could be big. I mean, what you said, it's quite strong in terms of economic aspects. I mean, a lot of cities with a big C, for instance, will lose on funding. Universities will lose on funding, all the businesses will lose on funding. The impact could be, I mean, it's not billions and billions and billions, but it's still, opportunities and funding, and the impact are very big. Andrew?
Undoubtedly, conversations and discussions, the sharing of practice, experience will continue on, but trade links will be less. I mean, it will just be more difficult for the underlying bits of our cities to trade with other cities or other localities, because frictional costs and all the rest of it, which we know very well about. But it's Friday evening, it's 6:30. We'll just take pick up a couple of points. I'll pick up on a point that both Anand said, and Anna Lisa as well. You know, there's this notion that we're in this zero-sum situation. This is why we've got to where we've got to in the last 10 years. We've had this politics now which says, you can only do well if I do badly. Right? Now, we understand why. We've had 10 years of stagnant wage growth, right? That sharpens the mind as to why my life isn't better than it was 10 years ago, why I have less money in my pocket. But the danger is, and we've heard it already, you know, cities are doing well because towns are not. That is blatantly not true. In a sense, you know, as I've tried to say, the nature of our economy is increasingly urban. It's not that if a firm or worker doesn't find what they're looking for in Bristol, it's not like they're going to the middle of nowhere to set themselves up. It's a city of some sort, right? You know, in a sense, our economy is much more urbanized. So we need to get away from this idea that it sucks in and it's all zero-sum, and I can only do better if someone else does worse. That's a bad place politically for us to get to, and it's a bad place economically, because we'll just talk about moving stuff around, rather than actually knowing for a fact that our cities are much more productive than non-cities. Our output is much more productive. Innovation is much more productive. Our workers earn more wages in cities than they do outside, even when we hold everything else about them constant, right? These are good things for us. They're not bad things for us. We have lots of challenges about connecting people in, making them more inclusive, making sure that people can take advantage of that stuff. But it's not because someone else has nicked the job. That's a bad place for us to get to, I would argue.
Do you see any possibility of Britain acquiring or developing more cities? Might any of these towns become cities?
Well, that's a good question. You know, there's an interesting, although somewhat anorak debate, but nevertheless, it's Sunday, it's Friday evening, so bear with me. There is an ongoing debate in the UK. Some of us take it seriously or less seriously, depending upon whether we have too many urban areas, right? Or we have too many urban areas of a similar size. Why is London successful? London is successful because, on one reason, it's big. There are returns to scale of just being a big place. Lots of stuff happens. And you see this across the globe. Our big cities are typically more productive. When you look at Manchester, or if you look at Leeds, Sheffield, Birmingham, the only other big city, biggish city, that is reasonably productive, just above the national average, is Bristol. All of our other big cities, actually, are below the national average. So there is an interesting question, not that we haven't got enough, that actually the consolidation of, and maybe the expansion of one or two of our mid-sized cities, might be the vehicle by which we get more productivity, more growth, more jobs, more wealth into our country more generally.
So we make more of the cities that we do have.
Yeah, you know, this is the story about can we better connect Leeds and Manchester and borrow some of the scale effects that we see in London by bringing those two places together, getting a kind of population of about 5 million.
Right, right. Okay, I want to open it up to the audience. Comments, questions? Yes, sir. Can you wait for just a second? I think a microphone will be finding its way to the front row, please. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. It's Sean Williams. I'm Friends of the Earth's regional campaign for South West England. I'm working a lot on air pollution in Bristol, particularly at the moment. And I just wanted to slightly challenge the narrative here about kind of the benefits of agglomeration in cities, that I guess we don't necessarily count the costs of moving people from further and further afield into the centre of a city. And I guess also challenge slightly the assertion that London's successful because of its size. I think there's exceptionalism that's related to the centralisation of power in London. So just a question really about whether we might actually be better off looking at spreading opportunity further and further outside of cities and across the country more evenly.
Andrew, do you see that?
If you've got and this is not a flippant response, if you've got a genuine, robust policy program for how we do that, right, spreading growth, I've heard that all the time. Everybody tells me, why don't we do this? Because it's very, very hard, in a sense, and the limits of policy need to be managed. So a genuine, and it's not a flippant response. If we could do that, we'd have done it. We've tried it in the past, it always ends up badly going wrong. Right?
Is it too expensive?
It's just too difficult. Yeah, think about why firms are in Bristol. they want to be in Bristol for a whole bunch of reasons. What we're going to say to them, you can't be in Bristol, you should go somewhere else. Really?
Yeah.
Or workers. No, we don't want high-skilled workers now. We don't want you to come to Bristol and enjoy the life of Bristol, that Bristol on. We want you to go somewhere else. Really? I think that's weird. On your congestion point, absolutely. All the tools to deal with congestion are available to us. What we lack is political will and courage to deal with them. It's not that we don't have the technical solutions. We can deal with congestion relatively easily if we have the political will to do it. And similarly on the housing front and affordability, there are options available to us. We lack political courage to take those decisions. So they are not political, they are political problems, not technical problems.
But there is a specific set of issues around the place and the role of London in our, well, both our politics and our economics, I think, in the sense that, one, it seems to be a matter of faith amongst public policymakers that the way to make other parts of the country richer is to make it quicker for them to get to London, which I've never quite understood. And actually, in a political sense, and this is where Britain and France are very, very similar, is Paris and London are increasingly sort of islands in a sea of politics that they don't resemble at all. And the comparison here for me would be a comparison with Germany. Because in Germany what you have is a centre of strong regional cities with no obvious dominant centre. And for all the economic downsides they might be, I mean, as I said, I'm just blagging here because I know nothing at all about cities. It just strikes me that Germany escapes a lot of the problems, not all of them, but a lot of the problems of core periphery polarisation that we suffer from, simply because it's not that centralised in one major centre.
Helen, you had a question. Can we get the microphone over here?
We have close connections to Scotland, and I just want a quick answer as to just how bad it's going to be if we come out for Scotland.
Well, the organisation I run, we're a sort of network of academics, and we've got a couple of teams of academics, one of which is based at the LSE actually, who've done a study of the impact on different regions of Brexit. Okay, and one of our teams has got some really quite ironic, I suppose, data that suggests that actually the best way to predict the economic impact, the scale of economic impact, is the scale with which a region voted to leave. That is to say that the more strongly a region voted to leave, the more exposed its economy is to the dangers of cutting trade with the European Union. So what you might well find, and it's different within regions, so cities are going to suffer far worse than towns because cities are more international and more networked. But within regions, because a relatively small amount of London's trade, now trade isn't the whole story, there's issues of immigration and stuff that you could add on to this, a relatively small proportion of London's trade compared to other major centres is with the European Union. It is relatively inoculated against the impact of the falling trade with the EU that we're going to get. So one of the sort of the nightmares, so Scotland and London are the two places under this analysis that will be least badly affected economically simply by falling trade. What that does mean, however, and in terms of our politics this is poisonous, is that the stronger you vote to leave, the more deleterious the economic consequences of leaving will be for you. And what happens then in political terms, heaven only knows.
There was a question at the back there, thank you.
It seems to me that at least half the population would reverse Brexit. It may be a majority by now, but we don't seem to have any mechanism open to us to do that. And my question is, do the cities, or maybe a network of cities, offer a mechanism for that option?
I'll leave the city bits to my colleagues, but actually the polls have hardly moved. I mean, there's been a wobble or two in the last 2 weeks, but basically the British population is split 50-50 still on this question. I suspect that if you, and it is absolutely the case that in our parliament there is a majority of MPs who oppose the kind of Brexit the government seems to be taking us towards, for a variety of reasons, whether it's Tories' fear of Corbyn or Labour's fear of deselection at the hands of Momentum. Those MPs are keeping their heads down at the moment. If the polls move, if by Easter next year you see that it's 70-30 saying it was a bad decision, I reckon some of those MPs will suddenly develop a bit of courage and start talking about it. But at the moment, there isn't evidence of widespread regret amongst people who voted leave about having voted leave. Let me just leave you one thought. I imagine most people here voted Remain because we're in the middle of Bristol. And there are a lot of people who are going around saying, what we need is a second referendum, we need to overturn the result, 51-49 the other way, Bob's your uncle, we're back in, we can pretend it never happened. Imagine what happens to our politics the day after we reverse the referendum by 51-49. It'll be like political Groundhog Day. We'll wake up, it'll be 2011. Nigel and Aaron Banks will be back in town with UKIP that's polling at 30%, and we'll end up doing it all again. So I'd caution you about a push to a second referendum unless there is a sustained and significant shift in public opinion.
Is there a question here, please?
Do you want to let them, I don't know if Andrew's got something to say about cities yet.
I stay away from politics. I think I would agree with the points made. I think it's the point I made towards the end of my opening comments. I turn it on its head and say it's increasingly difficult for national governments in countries where there is such a divergence of perspective, performance and outlook for them to nationally organise coherent programmes of activity. Yeah. And you can pick any issue, housing is a kind of classic. Try to think about a national policy that deals with the problems we've got in Bristol alongside the problems that we've got in Blackburn. Impossible. And yet that's exactly what we're doing. So we don't serve the needs of the people of Bristol, and we certainly don't serve the needs of Blackburn, and so on and so on. So the more variation we get internally, the more difficult it is for national governments that don't have federal systems and or don't work through coalitions to do that effectively.
This is a question really following on the kind of politics and economic power point, in that we're quite used to changing and rising economic power, shifting politics and political institutions by sort of working class, working class, women in politics, etc. What's striking about Brexit is that one of the striking facts is that if you are working, you will much more likely to vote Remain than not. So it seems to me that you have a disjunct between the economic actors and the political decision. And I just wonder how sustainable that is over the medium term, and what impact will it have on things like discussions on fiscal policy, tax, assets, growth policy, who takes the pain. It doesn't feel like a medium-term sustainable settlement.
Did you say if you were working?
I heard, I saw a stat that employed people were more like...
But we've got record high levels of employment, so the unemployed are only a small fraction of the bottom. You can measure it.
But when it's 52, 48, if you pay a lot of pensions out there, right?
Okay, I mean...
but that's some stats I saw.
Do you want to do this one? I mean, the Brexit coalition is a messy coalition. Okay, I mean, one way of putting it that I thought was quite interesting was it was a coalition between homeowners who don't have mortgages in poor eastern shire towns where the world feels like it's passing you by, and people in social rented housing in urban centres. So it's a Trump coalition, actually, in many, many ways. So it's very, very hard to categorise it simply in terms of socio-economic status, because there was that weird coming together of traditional political enemies. I mean, one of the reasons why our politics is in a mess is that the Brexit debate cuts straight through the traditional division of our politics. So there's no easy coalition. I just want to add one thing about what Andrew just said, because I think he's absolutely spot on about solving the problems of a country. There was a stage in the referendum campaign where, what's his name, the guy from Marx, Stuart Rose, who ran the Britain Stronger in Europe campaign, did a press conference and said, if we leave the European Union, house prices will fall, for heaven's sake. And of course, half the country in the north thought, fantastic. I'll have a bit of that. That sort of neatly summarised the problem, is that what for some parts of the country might be seen as a problem, for other parts of the country will be seen as an opportunity because of the divisions that exist.
Anna Lisa, you must see a lot of these similar kinds of divisions in other cities, in other countries.
Well, yeah, what I can say is that it's the first time I see a referendum that actually manages to change what the government wants to do or doesn't do, because you've had some referendums in other countries, but they were consultative. So even if the people decided not to stay in Europe, think of France. Yeah, when there was a referendum, that France stayed in the EU anyway. So it's more about looking at the specificity of the UK as well in this respect, how the referendum was treated and done. But anyway, what I would say is that the omelette is done, if we can say that. So I don't think we should say, yeah, the Leave are monsters and it's a bad choice. Okay, the reasons were some, you know, there's still reasons that we have to put with the reasons for a general crisis of the EU anyway, because that's what's happening in other countries. Maybe you don't get to a referendum because it's not called, but if you did, you would still have some kind of, you know, criticism towards the EU as it is today, as it is perceived, as it is lived, and so on. Why you know, it's not inclusive and all these kind of things. So I think, how can we make the most of this situation? Because I think it won't be possible to go back. It would be seen in a very difficult way. Even if you look at the perspective from the EU, I'm thinking about the other governments or even people. People were really, you know, kind of offended, if you see what I mean. Even normal people. They say, why the English people don't want us? Okay, already they say they go to Europe and when they are in Europe, but they also don't want us anymore. All the EU people that are working here and that suddenly don't feel welcome anymore. So they may want to leave. And so these kind of things. So I think that going back, it would be kind of weird. So how can we do something that, you know, to make the most of it and respond and try to propose things and make actually the EU react in a way that is not reacting now? Because today I don't think that, if I may say, I don't think that the EU institutions have really shown a willingness of changing their way to do politics. Off the record, don't tweet. Otherwise I won't get any funding anymore. But no, I'm joking. But still, I think that we need to challenge them much more. And that's the role of, I think, platforms like ours, to tell the EU, you must work with local leaders much more. To build a different type of Europe, to do things in a different way. You don't have to just churn out 10 priorities in your work program, Juncker, I'm thinking. You have to decide those 10 priorities with the people. And it's today the EU is mainly the governments, the 27 governments that decide. They are the power. It's not even the Commission. I mean, we were discussing this before. The Commission is a sort of, you know, machine that proposes ideas, that tries to do more things with a European kind of drive in mind to, you know, have more cohesion and things like that, if I can caricature. But the real decision makers that want to be, that are in some cases building walls between countries, think of the immigrant or refugees situation and so on, are the member states, are the governments. So it's also about an invitation of, when you think Europe, don't think Europe or Brussels, but think of the governments of the member states. It's the national governments that in the end decide. And behind the national governments are people and so on. So.
There's a question over here.
Hi, my name is Scott. I have one comment first, and I would have liked to see a mixed panel with Brexiter and non-Brexiter for, I think, a fairer discussion. I feel that is more orientated towards non-Brexit than Brexit. The other comment is, which I have been writing, is we are all criticizing the UK decision to leave the way it is being done, the uncertainties of the future, but what about the attitude of European bureaucrats who didn't listen to Cameron first when he went and tried before to obtain some deal for UK, who was brushed on the side? And what about the insider, the actual insider, the government, everything, who are trying to undermine the success of Brexit with propositions and suggestions which are not viable? And what about accepting the vote and the democracy of this country and work together against EU obnoxious attitude and try to get the best deal for UK and put a united front?
So are we all being a little defeatist, gloomy, and bad sports? And given that we are where we are, is there a way of thinking about cities going forward that's more productive?
for that. Well, I mean, we will have to make the best of it, right? But that's a meaningless statement. It's just a statement of fact. As I said earlier on, any deal, as favourable as it is, that is anything less than what we currently got, results in a negative economic fact. And to get your balance, you'd have to have probably about 100 economists saying what I've just said, and half an economist from somewhere very strange arguing the reverse. That would be a fair balance between the kind of current position amongst economic profession in terms of the effects that Brexit would have. So that if you want balance, you're going to have a much longer table to get those people on, because I think it's mistaken to have one for one. We've been there before, and that leads us to bad positions. So, you know, we have to do what we can do, but we have to be, I make no apologies for continuing to say it will be a negative experience on the economy when we leave the European Union given what we've got. I make no apologies for that, and the reason why is because I want us to have as close a deal as what we've currently got as is humanly possible. Anything less than that, you know, the further you go away from that, the worse it gets.
Can I?
Anand?
Let me say several things back to you. I think, A, Andrew's right. There is no serious economist out there who thinks that cutting trade with your nearest neighbour is going to have anything other than negative economic consequences, at least in the medium term. No one can see beyond the medium term, so who knows what happens after that. That's not to say it was irrational or ridiculous to vote for Brexit. There were many good reasons to vote for Brexit, depending on who and where you are. Part of the Brexit vote in this country, and this is this takes us back to cities and towns. Part of the Brexit vote in this country were that successful people in cities in this country spent the last decade and a half patting themselves on the back and forgetting about the other half of this country whose conditions of life were getting worse. And those people, I mean, one of the most interesting statistics about the referendum for me is that 2.8 million people who didn't find it worth their while to vote in the general election of 2015 voted in the referendum of 2016, and the majority of those people voted to leave. So this was as much a protest about the state of our country. It's not the Brexit, I mean, to an extent, it's not the Brexiters who should feel ashamed of themselves, it's the Remainers, because we allowed a situation to develop where enough people were willing to take a punt because they didn't like where we were at. Okay, and that's quite a leap to take. Most people don't vote for uncertainty. So the fact that your majority of people vote for what is going to be uncertainty, because we don't know what's going to happen, was quite something. Now, on the negotiations, the Brexiters were absolutely right in the referendum when they said the problem with the European Union is it's slow, it's legalistic, it's bureaucratic, it's inflexible. The problem is it's now being slow, bureaucratic, legalistic and inflexible with us. There is no way around that. It was always going to be thus. This doesn't again mean it's a bad idea necessarily. All I'm saying is the EU is like this. It's not a perfect organisation, far, far, far from it. But the problems inherent in our negotiations with the European Union are not the fault of the people who voted Remain and wish that everyone else had. Because I mean, when I lose in a general election, which I've tended to do for a lot of my life, sadly, I don't suddenly change party and join the winning side. I moan for 5 years. Okay, I wish the result could be overturned. I don't think you should expect the people who lost to be happy. The problems lie in the structure of the negotiations. Article 50 is a stupid piece of law because no country with the best government, with the most united cabinet, could possibly leave the European Union effectively in 2 years. It just cannot be done. That's the nature of the system. That's the nature of the negotiations there will be, which is why these negotiations will drag on until at least 2020. And it is down to the European Union, but that's just something we're going to have to face up to.
So I would add, on the cities thing, I would add, in terms of how we do more, we are an incredibly centralised country, politically, economically. We need to try and address that. And at the very least, we should be giving places like Bristol and Manchester and Leeds, and in fact, many more of our urban areas, not exclusively our urban areas, but certainly our urban areas, more control over the things that matter to the people who live in those places.
Yeah.
So they have more control over the things that really matter in terms of skills or transport or housing or air quality or whatever the questions and the issues are of the day in that place. At the minute, they don't really have much control over that. So at least in that sense, we can reintroduce some of that, and hopefully that engenders a participation by people in the political system, which then begins to deal with some of this apathy, which is understandable, that then results in the decisions and the issues that Anand's exactly said. So more power to our cities, breaking down some of the centralised systems, I think is going to be an important part to make the best of whatever the situation is whenever we leave.
By the way, I voted to stay in.
So, at the back. There.
Hi, my name's Andrew. I'm a student at the university here. There seems to be a sort of fetishisation of a post-Brexit Singapore-on-Thames. And maybe London could be Singapore, but the rest of the country couldn't. And so I wonder if there are, on a positive note, are there any lessons we can learn from kind of the New Zealand's, Canada's, Singapore's, etc. that keep getting kind of mentioned, but also if London is to survive, what is left for the rest of the cities in the UK? And how can we possibly learn from organisations like universities to collaborate better across borders, even kind of without membership of the single market?
So, Anna Lisa, in Eurocities you have members who are not part of the EU.
Yeah.
Do they do things that we might learn from?
Yeah, not part of the EU, so Europe as a geographical entity. So there you have people from Turkey, for instance, from Ukraine, from other parts of Europe. So there, of course, it's a platform. It's it's really open. You can put on the table whatever challenge that in the end of the day, all cities are going through the same kind of challenges. I mean, at different scale. They propose different solutions because the contexts are different, but the challenges are those: structural unemployment, climate change impact, democratic crisis, ecological crisis, all these kind of things. Disruptions, the digital transition. And so they're all living the same kind of challenges. So these kind of platforms are made exactly for that reason. And if you're talking about global cities, then you change scale in terms of size. So it's going to be a different kind of replication or inspirational way. But you have also other networks that work with the international cities. We focus on Europe as such, but yeah, it's definitely a tool.
Singapore and Thames, Andrew?
Yeah, I share your concerns in terms of the rhetoric around that. Although I think, Singapore, I think, is 90% of the housing state-owned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's an interesting kind of model. I think people underappreciate half the model, or even a bit of the model, and they forget all the other bits.
And it's not a democracy. And it's not a democracy.
So I think it's used ill-advisedly in terms of as models for us. In some respects, I think, in this regard, gives us a chance to think about the sorts of regimes that we want, and actually this shift to less regulation or less tax. Actually, increasingly there are conversations about getting that tax balance and that regime much more in balance, and we've lost some of that, I think, in the UK over the last decade or 2 decades.
Well, just a couple of things. Theresa May has said, you mentioned a bunch of countries that have virtually nothing in common as far as I can think. You say New Zealand, Canada, Singapore, but the Singapore thing, one of the problems we have is that the governing party is completely and utterly divided when it comes to economic policy. So for every Tory who thinks we should continue support for farmers, there's another one who thinks we should drop subsidies overnight. So it's very, very hard to know which way they're going to go. Theresa May has said as long as she is Prime Minister, which a while back seemed like it could be a long time, she will keep all social and employment protections that we enjoy under EU law on our statute book. So nothing's going to change immediately. What happens in the future, I don't know. But one of the things about Brexit that I find potentially quite encouraging, and we'll see what happens, is that being out of the European Union means that our politicians have to take responsibility for what happens in this country. To an extent they've never had to do so since we joined. It is too easy, and it's one of the lazinesses of EU membership, to simply say, well, look, that's Brussels. Unemployment in the European Union generally is nothing to do with Brussels, it's to do with appalling macroeconomic policies at home and fiscal policies at home. French unemployment is really not down to EU membership, but our politicians are going to have to, and it'll take a while, don't kid yourself, in 15 years' time you'll still hear politicians blaming the EU when we're being clear for 10. So it's going to take a while. But at a certain point in time, politicians have to take responsibility. And actually, citizens have to take responsibility for the politicians they elect. And another positive out of Brexit for me, if you think back before the referendum, what was the single greatest problem of our politics? Apathy and disinterest. Now, one of the things my organisation did in the run-up to the referendum was we did about 70 town hall meetings up and down the country in the run-up to the referendum, and it was amazing. People on trains, in restaurants, in pubs, were talking politics, and I thought that was fantastic. And actually, that level of interest, that level of enthusiasm that translates into a higher numbers of young people voting in the general election is something we should treasure. And actually, if our politicians being responsible for what happens in this country helps that, I think that would be good.
Anna Lisa?
What was the question?
Singapore on Thames.
Yeah, but I think I responded before.
Do you like Anand see any positives for us here?
No, I think you're finished. No. I think that as I said before, you have to make the most with what we have and with what has happened. And again, I think what you can do as citizens, especially in a city like Bristol, you're lucky. Because look how many people are there on Friday evening. It's not very. You've got
weirdos.
Look at that. You've got people that are interested, that are coming here to participate, that are active. Yep. So remain engaged. Go further with this kind of from the ground. As you say, be active in politics and be part of what you live. And if you do that, this will also change what Europe is about. Because you can do the difference also in a European level. Maybe it won't be through your MEP. But I mean,
no one knows. That's the problem.
Yeah, okay, but whatever. It won't be through the institution, but it will be about how for instance, the cities. Yeah.
Right. One last question. Just over there, please. Woman. Yep. Okay, well, let's take both questions in a row, and then we'll attempt to wind it up.
You said that this country would benefit from the population making the most of existing cities. What does that imply for the populace of small towns? And if the suggestion is that these people need to move into cities, how is that expected of them when house prices are so high and they may not have a degree, like you said?
Okay, and the lady over there?
Quick comment. My name is Anand. I'm from Voice for Change England, which is an umbrella organisation for charities. One of the things that really struck me about the panel is your pessimism in terms of going forward. And I find that really amazing that at a time when people have demonstrated the real power of democracy through the actual Brexit vote, but we're actually not looking more in a more forward kind of thinking way. Andrew talked about the level of trade between Britain and the EU, but made no mention of the relative decline in terms of world trade that Britain is suffering from through membership. Secondly, I think Anna Lisa was right in terms of the question of reform of the EU. I think it's absolutely necessary, but in terms of the ballot paper, that wasn't actually on the paper. The question was very succinct. But my final kind of question, I suppose, to the panel is really in terms of the issue of the city and the democratisation of cities. Isn't that where we should really be focusing our attention in terms of the relationship between the devolution of powers from the EU and the question of devolution at the national level? And those two things can be handled, I believe, at the same time.
Okay, so I'm going to ask quickly for a final comment from each of you. Andrew, you could address towns and then democratisation.
Yeah, so I agree in a sense, or at least towards the end of what you were saying. We can definitely deal with the democratisation of our urban areas, and I think we've all said that in different ways. Part of the response to Brexit is to give more real powers to places, our urban areas, but more generally, and we should definitely see that as part of the post-Brexit settlement, and we shouldn't allow our national politicians to get away with not doing that, which they will if we don't continue to press them. I mean, I think the point about towns and cities is not that everything happens in our urban areas, and it never will happen in our areas. There's always a distribution of activity. People like to live where they live and work where they work. It's just understanding the differences of what an urban area or city offers vis-a-vis a town. And it's when we get into this thing that a town can offer what a big city can offer, I think there is the zero-sum situation. But that's been, you know, the fact that house prices in Bristol are purely down to the fact that we do not, or have not for over 2 decades, built enough housing, which is a political decision, right? And therefore we lock people out of home ownership, we lock people out who want to live here. That is a political issue. And it's a crying shame that our most prosperous areas, for the last 20 years, we've been complacent in not allowing them to expand. And now we have the house prices, high houses that we have. Those are domestic policies determined by domestic politicians, and they have shirked making some of the tougher decisions that they should have made, and now we're in a problem of crisis.
Anna Lisa,
Yeah.
democratisation and towns.
Yeah, I think, well, devolution you're talking about, and I think it's very important. I wouldn't say the opposite, because I work for a network of cities. I've always worked in local government. I know what it means. I've worked in federal, system where the local governments were more powerful. If you look at, there are very many differences in Europe in this respect. And yeah, when cities have more power, things go better. I don't know if I can say that, but I agree with my colleague. So I think that yes, you need to go towards devolution. You need to go towards bigger braveness from the from politicians to make choices, to change things. You need to be brave, because some things you will need to change radically. Things, model of consumptions, economic models, and to really have an impact on how people live actually, and their quality of life. So you need braveness, and
I'm just going to address the point that the gentleman at the corner made. Now, you've never met me before, and if you had met me before, you'd know that my tone tonight has been positively euphoric compared to my normal tone when discussing anything from football to the weather. I mean, I'm generally a lot more pessimistic than I've sounded tonight, so that's slightly disappointing. But anyway, let me say 2 things to you, or 2 groups of things. Firstly, I think on trade, and we can talk about this afterwards, I just think you're wrong. And I think you're wrong on trade for the simple reason that I'm not an economist, okay, and I am amongst the first to criticise economists. But there's one body of economic theory that has stood the test of time. It is trade theory. And what trade theory shows us over and over and over again is you trade most with your neighbours, okay? Yes, the economies of Asia are growing. And yes, we traded a lot round the world in the 19th century. But trade is different to what it was in the 19th century. Now, in the 19th century, we didn't make cars with other countries. Now, modern manufacturing industry is about shipping parts across frontiers for just-in-time supply chains, back and forward, the same component crossing the channel 3 or 4 times to get that car made just in time, with the best will in the world. And I don't know, in 30 years' time, 3D printers might let you do this, but now you couldn't do that when you were making a car with New Zealand, because geography matters to trade, okay? So, yes, we can sign trade deals, not for a while, but we can. Yes, they'll make up for a tiny bit of the problems we're going to get if we're outside the single market and the customs union, which will decrease our trade. So I don't think there is a positive economic case if we're outside the single market and the customs union in the short to medium term. Thereafter, I do not know, but I think initially what will happen is our trade with our biggest trading partner will decrease. On the politics, I see quite a lot to be optimistic about. I've talked about participation, I've talked about the responsibility of politicians. The final thing I'd say, as I said before, I think one of the reasons this country voted to leave was dissatisfaction with the politics that were seen to be failing people. Now, one of the things this referendum has done has basically smashed the glass. It's shaken the kaleidoscope of our politics. The nature of political debate in this country is fundamentally different to what it was before the referendum. We're talking about intergenerational fairness. We're talking about the distinctions between the North and South and how to actually spread wealth about. We're talking about things we should have been talking about for the last 20 years. And I think if we can deliver on that, and if in 10 years' time we have a country whose economy is smaller but significantly fairer, then I'll say, fantastic, we did the right thing. I have not enough faith in my politicians to think that that's where we will end up, but I think it's a better chance than it was before, and fingers crossed.
So with that euphoric ending, I will thank all the speakers. Thank you for your contributions and for coming to